Hello, and welcome to today's program, Challenges for Korea's Democracy. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Chelsie Alexandre, and I'm the Policy Program Officer at the Korea Society. Today's program will provide an update to the developments taking place in South Korea after the now suspended President Yoon Suk Yeol declared martial law last December. Since then, we've witnessed an impeachment, the historic first arrest of a sitting South Korean president, and a constitutional court proceeding to decide Yoon's fate. We've invited three experts to unpack the latest and give us an idea of what to expect next. Kelly Kasulis Cho is a breaking news reporter and editor at the Washington Post's Seoul Hub. Welcome, Kelly. Daniel Sneider is a lecturer in East Asian Studies at Stanford. Thank you for joining us, Dan. And Andrew Yo is a senior fellow and the SK Korea Foundation chair at the Brookings Institution Center for Asia Policy Studies. Welcome, Andrew.
It's great to be here.
Before we jump in, I want to thank the Korea Foundation and our corporate sponsors for making this program possible. And thank you all for joining us virtually. Please send your questions throughout the program to policy@koreasociety.org. We will have an audience Q&A at the end of the moderated discussion. So now I'll turn it over to Jonathan to start the conversation.
Thank you very much, Chelsea. Thanks to our audience for tuning in today, and thanks for our amazing speakers for bringing their insights to this conversation, which is a very dynamic situation, a lot going on, but we're going to try to keep it high level and focus on what all these developments are going to mean in the long-term perspective. So let's just start by reviewing what the situation is like right now. Earlier today in Korea, the Constitutional Court decided to hold another hearing next week for suspended President Yoon Suk Yeol's impeachment proceedings. If they decide to convict, that would start a 60-day clock to hold a snap election. So the timing here will be determined by how the Constitutional Court proceedings continue. Expectations that they could hand down a verdict around early March, so early next month. So Kelly, I'll start with you. Can you tell us the significance of what's happening right now? What do we need to know?
Yeah, it's been interesting after all of the chaos that occurred in early December and thereafter with two acting presidents coming in after Yoon. We're kind of in this holding pattern right now where the South Korean public is basically waiting for a verdict. As you mentioned, today was supposed to be the last day that we had an impeachment hearing, but another one was scheduled last minute for early next week. But I mean, things are starting to really wrap up here. Witnesses that have been called have kind of refused to answer questions at this point. And earlier this week, after six hearings, two lawyers on the impeachment panel have essentially said that they feel like enough evidence has been presented to suggest that what Yoon has done by declaring martial law is unconstitutional and illegal, and they particularly pointed to his attempt to stop political activities during what ended up being a 6-hour declaration of martial law, as well as, police efforts to stop lawmakers from entering the National Assembly and voting it down that night, as they were ultimately able to do. What we've seen is that President Yoon has essentially denied most of the major allegations against him, including that he ordered the arrest of key oppositional political figures. And he's really forwarded this idea that he supposedly declared martial law because he believed that election fraud had occurred and that he had no choice due to a gridlock in the National Assembly, which is, seeing a Democratic Party, so an oppositional majority. And his opponents have essentially said that those claims are irrelevant. They've pointed to the fact that investigations have shown that there is no real evidence of election fraud on a substantial scale, and they've called it propaganda, essentially. And just on the ground here, I think what's been happening has been really interesting because we're seeing things heat up a little bit. South Korean authorities have said that they will crack down if pro-Yoon protests continue to be violent. I read in Reuters yesterday that 63 people were indicted over the courthouse rush that happened by Yoon supporters. And I mean,
can you just briefly describe that, the courthouse rush? What was that?
Yeah, I mean, it's if you even look at how Yoon was his arrest or detainment, if you will, was delayed by pro-Yoon supporters. They were actually able to accomplish a lot in slowing this process down. And so some Yoon supporters, and I try not to make this representative of the South Korean majority because it's not, clashed with police a little bit in support of Yoon. And so we're seeing, the original declaration of martial law was kind of praised as the South Korean public defending their democracy without any violence, and now we are seeing a little bit of violence, and we're also seeing that Yoon's approval rating is going up a little bit, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, later. But we're in this moment of flux as we're waiting for a verdict.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kelly. And yeah, we are going to get to those very interesting trends and changes in the public sentiment a little bit later, but want to open up the floor now to Andrew and Dan for any follow-on comments there.
Well, one thing I am struck by is that the testimony before the Constitutional Court, as it at some points has been quite dramatic, but I think pretty convincingly has made the case that this was an attempted coup d'etat, and the justifications for it that Yoon and his supporters have offered in the court were pretty easily disproved or dismissed on the basis of not only the evidence presented by the lawyers, but also on the testimony that's been given, particularly by some of the military officials who really contradicted a lot of what Yoon has claimed was the case. So I'm wondering, and I would put this as a question perhaps to Kelly and maybe to Andrew, whether we feel confident now that 6 out of the 8 sitting judges in the court are going to uphold the
Yeah.
impeachment. And if they didn't do that, what kind of crisis would ensue from that?
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's not a foregone conclusion. And so the Yoon camp is trying to say more testimony needs to be offered, and this needs due process will take longer. But the court seems to prefer a pretty brisk pace here. So we see those two dynamics kind of in tension with one
Yeah.
another.
Let me just jump in here as well and maybe partly respond to Dan's question. I mean, there has been a lot of focus on the court case. They just did the 7th hearing, and as Kelly mentioned, they thought that a verdict would come out, but I think excuse me, I think the courts they're being very careful. They're scrutinizing this closely, even though it seems like an easier case than upholding Park Geun-hye's impeachment, which was quicker. But again, I think that the court wants to review everything, and but I like to say this is a calm before the storm because whatever verdict comes out, half the country may not be happy with it, and so if the courts, I mean, the court will make their decision, but you can imagine if the martial law is not supported, then or if they they let if they let Yoon Suk Yeol off the hook, there's going to be a lot of protests, is my sense. And on the flip side, will we see the repeat of these violent protests of the far right groups that we saw against the courthouse if the impeachment decision is upheld? So either way, like I said, it's kind of the calm before the storm, but the institutional process still has to play itself out.
Yeah, much hangs in the balance still, and this drama will continue to unfold. So as we pull away from the minute by minute happenings on the ground in Korea, let's look at some of the deeper structural reasons for why these sorts of things seem to happen over and over again in Korea. Andrew, I want to start with you, referencing an article that you wrote in The Hill with Aram Her, who spoke in the predecessor program to today's talk, Implications of Martial Law, which we did with Michelle Lee, Kelly, your colleague. So you wrote in that article that nationalist polarization has turned South Korean politics into a blood sport. So can you unpack what you meant by that and maybe some of the broader arguments from that article?
Sure, right. And so the arguments that Aram and I co-author, but it comes from an academic paper where we talk about this concept of nationalist polarization. And we're familiar with polarization in party politics, but nationalist polarization is a specific form of partisan polarization where the parties are divided on really mutually exclusive visions of the nation. So there are these differences about who we are, about the direction of the country, where we ought to be heading. And under nationalist polarization, the end goal is not really representation, but it's to implement one's own policy preferences at all costs and to and to try to eliminate or defeat the opposition rather than work across the aisle. Now, it sounds pretty familiar. Someone might say, "Are you talking about the United States?" But similar
Yeah.
dynamics in South Korea. And so, what's lost are these norms of forbearance, norms of mutual tolerance, which function as informal guardrails of democracy. And we've RMI were saying that these violations have been rampant in South Korean politics for decades, in part because of the way nation and state building occurred around the time of intertwined with democratization. And so what you see is in the past, the authoritarian regime and the democracy movement and that conflict, I think it becomes institutionalized in some ways in party politics. So we see remnants from President Yoon talking about North Korea, like the anti-state forces that are aligned with North Korea, and kind of that we see the opposition, which has its lineage from this democracy movement. But as an example of how it played out in the recent episode of martial law, President Yoon claimed that the opposition-controlled National Assembly motioned to impeach 22 of his appointments, including the Minister of the Interior, the chairperson of the Communications Commission. And the opposition also moved to investigate Yoon's wife on corruption charges 3 times, which of course Yoon vetoed every time. And conversely, the ruling Conservative Party has also put the opposition Democratic Party, Lee Jae-myung, through the ringer, indicting him on various charges of corruption, finally convicting him of election fraud. And so what we're seeing again is both sides, especially when they're in power, they're willing to use that power, use lawfare, libel laws, politically motivated investigations to really go after the opponents. And so that's why we see this, fundamental gridlock. And my concern is that even if we move past this episode, let's say that Yoon Suk Yeol's impeachment is upheld and we have another candidate, the front runner is Lee Jae-myung, even if he's elected. So you can say that South Korean democracy is successful. They managed this transition through its democratic process, but the fundamental issues of the nationalist polarization is still there. And who's not to say that 2, 3 years down the road that the next president will also be impeached. So,
Right.
so those are some of the underlying concerns that we're facing.
That's really instructive. Thank you so much, Andrew. So Dan, I'll turn to you, and you've invoked a favorite work, Gregory Henderson's Politics of the Vortex, in a recent article, and you've argued that Korea remains subject to, quote, centralization of power and intense factionalism, although there has been a growth in civil society and wider political participation. So that book from Gregory Henderson is from decades ago, right before Korea's democratization, but we still see some of those themes continue today. So what's changed and what's still the same in Korean politics?
Well, I was a reporter back in the 1980s and second half of the 80s, and so I covered uh, the overthrow of the military regime in 1987 and the growth of democratization in Korea. And Gregory Henderson's book was kind of a Bible of mine, and I think it remains in many ways quite an interesting guide because his emphasis was on, first of all, a high degree of centralization of power in Korea. And I think that's a phenomenon which has persisted even up until the present time. I mean, in the Korean system, and this is something that's widely discussed in Korea in the context of seeking some ways of engineering political reform, concentrates power excessively in the hands of the executive, in the hands of the president. And it tends to be that other institutions, whether particularly the National Assembly, but even the courts and so on, are far weaker for the most part in the way that power is distributed in the Korean system. For instance, regional governments also are not highly empowered in the Korean system. So I think the dangers of centralization are quite visible now. And the other thing that Henderson wrote about and other people wrote about is there's a great degree of deep factional struggle, but it's often not about ideology. It's about personal structures of power, relationships amongst groups of people within the elite. And I saw that, for example, in 1987 when the military regime fell and the two principal leaders of the opposition, of the longtime opposition, Kim Young-sam and Kim Dae-jung, couldn't agree between them on who should be the president. As a result, the military successor actually succeeded. But there again, sort of personality politics is such a huge element of Korean political life. That said, it's a different Korea than it was in the 80s. Although I think for many Koreans, the events of the last few months have created an intense flashback for those who experienced that and also educated the younger generation about, what had gone on before. But I think that we do see a tremendous growth of civil society. That's all flows from Korea's democratization. And it's not only the mobilization of people on the streets, I think it's also the sense of ownership, if you will, of civic engagement. And again, that's not entirely new in Korea, but I think those sort of mediating institutions, which weren't there before, are really important. And I count on that in terms of the ability to manage this transition through this crisis, because I think that I'm impressed, frankly, by still the passion and the commitment, I think, of most Koreans to the preservation of, democratic institutions, which were created through a great deal of struggle. So I'm a little more optimistic, if you will, but I do think the issues of structural reform are very much at the forefront now.
Very well put. Thank you so much, Dan. And now, Kelly, over to you. You wrote a great piece called Exiled, Shot, Impeached, Jailed. And it goes through the unfortunate fates of many of Korea's past presidents. So can you just give us a quick overview of that? And why do you think that this is the case, that former Korean presidents seem to have so much trouble, legal trouble, personal trouble, and even early expiration dates?
Yeah, I think Andrew and Dan already did a really good job of kind of explaining that there's this polarized kind of yo-yo effect that we see play out again and again in South Korea's fairly short political history. And, I'm sure many of us are already familiar with the fact that most, certainly more than half of South Korea's presidents have faced some kind of serious accusation against themselves or their family member while in office or shortly after leaving office, and much worse results like the assassination of Park Chung-hee or the sentencing to prison of multiple presidents, Park Geun-hye being impeached and jailed, Yoon now potentially facing a very similar fate, to the point where Moon Jae-in, one of our recent presidents, is often looked back upon fondly, despite being, a reviled figure among conservatives, just because he had a pretty smooth transition out of the Blue House, so to speak. And, nothing has really materialized against him all in all compared to other presidents. One thing that I do think has been interesting for me is that, I'm of that generation that hasn't lived through South Korea becoming a democracy. I've only heard about it from my mother and grandmother and history books and things like that. And on the night of martial law, I really caught a glimpse into various generations' interpretations of those events and how close to home it was for all of them still.
Yeah,
The older folk I spoke with were obviously very emotional and outraged because they feel like they've lived
right.
through this or the aftermath of this. And then the younger people like myself were kind of rolling into the scene in a state of disbelief. Like I still didn't really believe what was going on was truly going on until I saw the black helicopters flying overhead and the
Hmm.
army tank. And then it felt real. And I think a lot of people showed up who were young just to witness this and to really see it for themselves and to take up their chance to participate in the democratic process and protest. And speaking to experts in the last few weeks, completely unprompted, almost all of them that I interviewed to kind of get their sense of Yoon's political calculations and why he would do this, they used the words isolated and out of touch again and again. And I never fed that to them. And they had said that, his declaration of martial law kind of gave us a glimpse into this idea that he has a leadership mindset that sort of mirrors the authoritarian top-down thinking of earlier Korean presidents, and that he's out of touch with the South Korean public and thinking that that would work,
Right.
and that they wouldn't fight for their democratic rights. And so I hope that gives you a sense of just kind of how, things that happened in the 60s, 70s, and 80s are still playing out today. And I think to Dan's point that he made earlier, the way that things have been going, there's no saying that I won't see multiple more impeached presidents in my lifetime in South Korea.
Very well put, and thank you so much. So I want to get a sense for how political sentiments are quickly changing in Korea right now. So immediately following the martial law episode in early December, it looked like in a snap election, the Democrats would have a very, very heavy advantage. But that lead has since narrowed significantly. And in particular, we've seen young people and middle-aged people move from the left to the right. And although a majority still support Yoon's impeachment, their favorability of who should follow has since shifted. So, Andrew, I'll start with you, and hoping you could give us a little bit of insight into why you think this is happening and what that translates into in terms of the politics for a snap election, if there is one.
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating dynamic because if you had asked people the week after President Yoon declared martial law, they would have said the People Power Party, the PPP, they're done. Like
Yeah.
they're finished. And yet we've seen them roaring back and they're basically neck and neck in terms of polling with the Democratic Party of Korea. And I think there's a couple of things we can look at. First is on the conservative side, Yoon's own messaging to his supporters and his vow to keep fighting have helped unite his supporters, as well as those who remain fairly lukewarm to the Democratic Party of Korea and also Lee Jae-myung. Park Geun-hye was, she was silent. She kind of disappeared after she was impeached, but President Yoon's writing letters to his supporters, and we saw that they had to, it took a couple of weeks to just get him out of his home with the Corruption Investigation Office because he was going to go down fighting, and that's rallied his base. On the other dynamic, on the Democratic Party side, I think their shine and luster after their heroic stand to stop martial law at the National Assembly has worn off, or it was started to wear off as they pushed impeachment proceedings against first Prime Minister Han Duck-soo and other administration officials, and even with the current acting president, who is also the finance minister, acting president Choi Sang-mok. They were upset because he wasn't quickly appointing judges to the three open seats in the Constitutional Court, and so they were threatening him, and that's where kind of ordinary Koreans were saying, we still want stability in the country, and if you get rid of all the leaders, it's our country's going to fall apart, and so I think that's also affected their standing in the polls. But now that the shock of martial law is worn off, and with there's been some passages of time, Yoon's been imprisoned. I think we're now kind of focusing on the court ruling and the real possibility of snap elections. And I think as people think about the possibility of Lee Jae-myung becoming the president or a front runner, he has a lot of political baggage as well too. There's cases, corruption cases. He's been actually indicted in one of those cases, but I think that looms ahead. And so what it means is that I think if there are a snap election, it's going to be a very close election, and that the PPP, the Conservative Party, they still have a chance. I think they're polling behind the Democratic Party, but again, it does mean that there could be a close election if those are held, especially if if moderates and hardliners within the Conservative Party can find a consensus candidate. I think that'll be the next thing to look at if we do move towards elections of who are going to be the candidates, especially for the PPP.
Very good. Thank you, Andrew. Very helpful. And so turning now to Dan and Kelly, and I'll just prompt, thinking through, especially these young and middle-aged voters, why has that shift happened? Does it have anything to do with particular policies, that they align naturally more with the right than with the left, and that's emerged as a bigger priority for them. Is that a factor here? I'm thinking especially in terms of, inter-Korean policy, foreign policy things, if that affects this at all. So Dan, over to you.
Well, I've learned the hard way that it's a really bad thing to try and predict Korean politics. And I don't entirely trust the polling that we're seeing now. I think there's to some degree a certain kind of, ironically, the Democratic Party is kind of suffering from an anti-incumbent kind of feeling because, in
Yeah,
some sense, they're now seen as the party in power um, because there is no government effectively. They control the National Assembly. They're running the process. So they're getting a little bit of that sort of anti-incumbency
yeah,
backlash there. When you actually get to an election and you have candidates and we see who's facing off against whom, I suspect the polling dynamics are going to probably shift in some significant ways. I'm not saying it might not be a close election as Andrew predicts, but well, I'm a little skeptical of this idea that there's a sort of conservative wave that's going on. I think the other thing is that the Conservative Party, the PPP, is deeply split within itself. And that's been true for a while. Uh, Most of the members of that party are not big fans of President Yoon. There's been to some degree a rallying in some sense, in defense of themselves against the Minjunong, against the progressives. But once that, if impeachment goes ahead, I suspect to see a lot of splintering on the conservative side. And there are tensions within the Democrats as well, but I think they're far more unified in that sense than the conservatives are. So I'm a little wary of getting too wrapped up in the ups and downs and the swings of polls at this point because the
yeah.
setting is going to shift pretty dramatically within a matter of days, probably, certainly weeks.
Yeah, I also, it's interesting hearing you say that, Dan, because I've also had a similar thought about the polls. It's been a little difficult to put my finger on the pulse of exactly where the South Korean populace stands. And some of the headlines that I've seen have made me kind of a little skeptical. I saw that after Yoon declared martial law, his approval rating was somewhere around 11%, according to Korean media outlets. That makes sense probably for a man who appeared to try to take over the country with, kind of an authoritarian playbook. But it supposedly soared in recent weeks to 40%, which I think is close to around the height of what we saw with Moon Jae-in when diplomacy was going well with North Korea. And that just seemed, I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just saying that it seems a little confusing and off base for me. One thing that I have found interesting, I'm always thinking about public opinion in terms of conspiracy theories and social media, and also our kind of out of tune finger on the pulse issue with public opinion being that, Yoon has been very loud from the detention center, and so have his supporters. And sometimes loud voices can be distorted and misunderstood as the popular voice or the common voice or a sense of public opinion. And I'm not exactly sure. At the same time, as I think Andrew mentioned, there is this sense of antipathy towards Lee Jae-myung because of the legal proceedings against him, and also this kind of reputation as a career politician and an establishment figure. And so I think all of that kind of plays into this. And just to add, and this might be a bit of a US centric view, but I feel like this coming in at a time where Trump has taken the White House has been very interesting because we're seeing kind of this legitimization happening right now of the sentiment that there's solidarity between Yoon supporters and Trump supporters, and that there are similar allegations of election fraud that have occurred there. There are similar allegations that the opposition party of the US or of South Korea are kind of on this witch hunt against their president. We've seen Stop the Steal being co-opted by Yoon supporters. We've seen criticism towards bureaucracy in US Congress as well as the National Assembly. And so I'm seeing a lot of similarities
Right.
there in terms of the kind of movement that is going on.
Really great insights. Thank you, Kelly. This is a good moment for transition because uh, just like Yoon Suk Yeol and his supporters have compared his situation to President Donald Trump, Lee Jae-myung has also compared himself to President Donald Trump in terms of the political witch hunt against him. He claims it's a political witch hunt. So he has been convicted of election law violations, and he could be barred from running if that ruling is upheld. So I want to look at a potential Lee Jae-myung victory. What would that mean? What are the prospects for that? Especially an election against the conservative leader in the polls right now, who is Kim Moon-soo, the labor minister. How do we think about that matchup? So we'll start with Dan.
Well, I think, the last election was, of course, Lee Jae-myung against Yoon, and that was probably, I think it's the closest election we've seen in Korea during the entire democratic period. They were separated by a percentage and a half. So people know Lee Jae-myung pretty well. He ran before. He was a popular governor to some degree. But I think that I suspect the framing of this election is going to be different than the last time around. So Yoon was able to win that election in part because he presented himself as a reformer, as someone, a non-politician who was going to, sort of bring the skills of a independent prosecutor to governance. Well, that imagery has been blown apart. So I suspect the framing of this election is going to be quite different. I, I think to me, the weight of the sort of political tides here is in favor of the Democratic Party. It's in favor of the return of the progressives. And after all, they won a pretty convincing victory in the National Assembly elections earlier. And I am anticipating they will return to power. I don't know that it will happen, but I think we need to think about what it means. And obviously, from an American point of view, the foreign policy questions are pretty significant because the Korean Democrats have been critical of many aspects of the foreign policy of the Yoon administration that the U.S. has been extremely supportive of, particularly the Biden administration, the improvement of relations with Japan, Korea's support for the Ukrainians, the embrace of this sort of regional security framework, Indo-Pacific framework on the part of Korea's sort of tougher line, if you will, towards North Korea, kind of a movement back from the sort of pro-engagement policy. So all those things I think will be on the table if the progressives come back to power. I have been impressed that Lee is making a pretty concerted effort, maybe it's PR, to convince Americans and others that he's a pragmatist, he's not an ideologue, he doesn't want to roll back the improvement of relations in Japan. He embraces the alliance with the U.S., and he's not ready to run into the arms of the Chinese, which of course is one of the accusations from the right. I mean, it remains to be seen, but I think we Americans need to get ready for the shift in power in Korea and be willing and ready to engage the progressives in a useful dialogue. Of course, Trump coming to power makes things so much more complicated because you have an American government that doesn't necessarily believe in alliances and which Trump seems to be still enamored of the idea of returning to the negotiating table with the North Koreans, with Kim Jong-un, and that could be an extremely complicated thing to do in the midst of this type of political change in South Korea.
Right. And, you mentioned that Yoon Suk Yeol's administration was very much in sync with what the Biden administration was trying to do regionally. And there are certain ways in which a future Lee Jae-myung presidency could actually sync up with what the Trump administration is trying to do in the region, right? Increased autonomy for South Korea, increased focus on inter-Korean relations, that sort of thing, diplomatic engagement with North Korea. So that is one area of potential alignment amidst all this transition and uncertainty and instability. But I want to open it up to Andrew and Kelly for any of your thoughts.
Well, if we're talking about foreign policy here, there are some with Lee Jae-myung as a president. There's some opportunities, and you mentioned the key one. I think it's engagement with North Korea. A part where one area where there might be friction, though, is when it comes to broader Indo-Pacific policies, just because my sense is that the Trump administration is going to push pretty hard on China, given the number of China hawks in the administration, given that they're now saying, well, we want to shift away from Ukraine because we have to focus on China. And they're going to the Trump administration is going to press US allies, Japan, Korea, Australia, to also do more. And I don't know how comfortable Lee Jae-myung will be in going along with this policy of really pushing China, especially on the military front. And so there may be some friction there. But I will say that regardless of who becomes the next president in South Korea, if the impeachment is against Yoon Suk Yeol is upheld, that they'll want to work with the United States regardless. I think that's the default position, and that's something that I think the Democratic Party is trying to message to those in Washington, that they want to engage the U.S. and that they can work together. On the conservative side, I think it's the flip side. I think they'll be more likely to go along with a policy that they're cautious about China, but because President Yoon has already been moving in a direction of expanding the U.S. South Korea alliance to play a larger role in the Indo-Pacific, that a conservative president might be willing to go along with Trump's urging to do more in the region and to counter China. But on the North Korea issue, it's the complete opposite. I think if Trump starts reaching out to Kim and he's not talking about denuclearization, if he's not allowing South Korea into those conversations, I think there's going to be some friction there. So I'll stop there. Happy to follow up, pass it back to you, Jonathan.
Thank you. Yeah, and what I was alluding to earlier when I was talking about the younger and middle-aged South Korean voters who have changed their views, one of the things that I would insist has become important here is that anti-China views have risen across the country, right? And so that's been a shift. That's the center of gravity has changed, right? And also views on North Korea have changed and hardened over time. So that puts the Democrats in Korea in a position where they kind of have to rebalance and find where that center of gravity is within their own support base and for the larger electorate. But Kelly, turning to you for any thoughts about this one.
Yeah, I think if I'm thinking about this from the South Korean voters' perspective, what happened with the martial law declaration really injected a sense of instability that has kind of maybe moved the needle a little bit, where what the public is now seeing rather than kind of an anti-establishment figure, it might actually be someone who's going to bring back a sense of peace to the country. And I'm not really sure what that means right now, given that it's kind of hard to gauge public opinion and how truly conservative the population really is leaning. But someone like Lee Jae-myung might represent a little bit more of like a well-poised, safe space. In that we're dealing with kind of a wild card president in Washington. And there's been a lot of anxiety leading up to Trump coming into office, and this kind of sense of a power shift vacuum in South Korea about whether or not South Korea is going to be on the strongest footing to deal with him if he really does try to renegotiate terms of the Korea-US free trade agreement, or if he really does follow through on his idea that South Korea should be paying for US troops' presence here, or if he radically changes what he might do with North Korea. I think the South Korean public wants someone who has a long career in this and is well prepared to deal with him and is maybe taking a more steady, metered approach. And the labor minister has a bit of a reputation to be kind of an off-the-cuff, brash figure who makes controversial statements and worries about the repercussions later. And that might also appeal, I don't know, but my sense is that there's a greater feeling of anxiety on how to deal with South Korea's closest ally, which is the United States, now that Trump is in office. And I think that's going to factor into this a lot.
Yeah, very interesting political career for Kim Moon-soo, who migrated over from being a labor activist to the conservative camp, right? So that complicates his image as well. I see we have some interest in making further thoughts, so we'll do Andrew.
Yeah, I
and Dan.
just wanted to add one sort of irony here, which is that there's an odd possible synchronization between Trump and a progressive government in Korea. And that is that if Trump moves down the road of withdrawal of the U.S. presence in South Korea, which he certainly is something he was thinking about at the end of his first term, or at least undermines the reliability of the American extended deterrence guarantee to South Korea. That actually, in some ways, mirrors the views of some people on the left in Korea who are eager, in some ways, also to separate Korea from its security dependence, from its alliance dependence on the United States. And that overlap, that convergence, frankly, worries me quite a bit. I agree with Kelly that Korean voters probably don't want to go there, but I think there are some people, Korean politicians, and if Trump feeds into that, it could gain a little momentum.
And then how much longer in that scenario until South Korea decides to pursue its own indigenous nuclear deterrent, right? That's something that the polling has shown with increased concern over the U.S. extended deterrent credibility, that option gains a lot more favorability among strategic elites. That's something that Victor Cha at CSIS did some research about. Andrew, any final thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, Dan made a really important point that there are some progressives within the Democratic Party that share this view that they would eventually want to see U.S. troops withdraw. So there would be at least less resistance, I think, to that idea, and maybe in an ironic way, some synergies between a Democratic Party government and the Trump in South Korea and the Trump administration. But that's where I think we'll see some of these battles play out. Some of you may know, Representative Lee Sung-lak, he was Lee Jae-myung's foreign policy advisor when candidate Lee was running for president. And of course, he's someone who's a centrist and supports the alliance, and he's been trying to come to DC and rebrand Washington's views of the Democratic Party, but does he speak for the entire party? And the answer is, well, we don't know. I mean, he says yes, but people have their own, other progressive party members have their own view. And same thing with Kim Moon-soo. The polls are showing him as the leading conservative candidate, but as Kelly and Dan mentioned, who knows? South Korean polls, they can flip on a dime.
Yeah.
And the issue with him is that he's part of he speaks to the conservative base. It's going to be very hard for him to rally enough votes, especially from moderates, to win a general election. And yeah, so that's obstacle number one for him. But in terms of foreign policy as well, too, maybe as Kelly mentioned, South Koreans are looking for kind of steady and stable. I mean, those aren't the adjectives I might describe Lee Jae-myung with, but he does have more political experience, and they've thought about how they should approach alliances and these other issues. And I'm not sure if South Koreans really want to see another conservative candidate, really. I mean, there's this thing where you want to support the alliance, but sometimes you can do too much. You're giving 150% and only thinking about the alliance, and that could go oddly in a confrontational direction with President Trump if Trump doesn't like what he's seeing from South Korea, but the conservatives keep coming to Washington over and over with certain asks or certain reassurances. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And so I think we've covered pretty much the foreign policy and alliance implications of potential Democrat or PPP president to succeed suspended President Yoon Suk Yeol in a snap election. So I just want to talk about some of the domestic policy implications for South Korea if we see either one of those camps win. So Kelly, what are your thoughts? How would an Lee Jae-myung or Kim Moon-soo or anybody, a DP versus PPP president, sort of have priorities in terms of their domestic agenda with the same sorts of issues that we saw in the last election of Yoon Suk Yeol versus Lee Jae-myung? Would those be on people's minds, or do you think the conversation has shifted since then to new issues?
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying that it's for me a little hard to assess Kim versus E maybe in a way that is fair, and that Lee Jae-myung has already run for president and has made his platform more clear in his time as governor and mayor and in the last election cycle. Whereas Kim, I think less than 2 weeks ago, told reporters that he had no plans that he had not thought about putting his hat into the ring. And he might just be playing coy because he said that it would be disrespectful to Yoon to do so. But as someone who is not as likely to pull in moderates and is more pandering to a conservative base, and then on top of it has been signaling that he hasn't even thought about running for president, it's kind of hard to weigh those two track records on equal footing. With that said, looking at Lee Jae-myung's career, he's forwarded a lot of ideas that speak to some of the issues that I think younger South Koreans are chronically dealing with. South Korea has a big youth unemployment problem. Obviously, we
Yeah.
know about the birth rate problem and this feeling that people are not able to live the lives that their parents could have lived with the kind of economic growth that they saw during their time, and people are
Yeah.
not willing to get married. Lee Jae-myung definitely has expressed that he wants to expand social welfare programs. He's certainly pandered to some younger people by saying he supports a 4-day work week.
Hmm.
He's proposed the universal basic income in the past. He talks about things like renewable energy, and I don't see as much of that from Labor Minister Kim. But then again, it might also be because he hasn't had a chance to run for
Right,
president yet.
right. Very well put. Okay, I'll open it to Dan and Andrew for any final thoughts on domestic policy implications, and then we'll turn it over to Chelsie for some of our audience questions.
I just had one thought I wanted to add, which is that I think one of the most important pieces of what's happened in the last few months is that Yoon's attempted coup really threatened for the first time in quite a while to re-involve the Korean military in politics.
Yeah.
And I think what I found particularly heartening was the refusal of a significant part of the Korean military at a
Yeah.
leadership level and below that to fall into that temptation to join power politics again. And that to me is probably one of the great tributes, if you will, to the strength and depth of democratic institutions in Korea. And I take a great deal of
That's a good point. And, shades of Gwangju, 1980, and then questions because of OPCON and the fact that the U.S. Has control over a lot of South Korean forces in a time of war, right? There are some complicated implications for the South Korean military making a move like that if it were to uphold martial law. That would reflect on the United States and put the United States in a very difficult position of deciding what to do in that case. Andrew, over to you for any final thoughts here.
Yeah, we haven't really mentioned the economy much, but I'm assuming that if we do move towards snap elections, I think that what's on the immediate mind of voters is really the economy. The one is at a 16-year low right now in terms of growth. Banks are forecasting they're lowering forecasts for South Korea's economic growth as well too. Jobs is an issue. Demographics, the declining population. That's more of a longer term issue. But those are issues that are facing, I think, the South Korean public. And in terms of the candidates, we've seen Lee Jae-myung becoming more of a, I guess, or he's adopting more of the conservative position, trying to talk about growth and mentioning policies that are more pro-business. That may or may not backfire for him because he may be losing some of the base. And then for someone like I'm not sure if Kim Moon-soo will be the candidate or not. I'll just leave it at that. I'm not sure. But in terms of his policies, he was a former labor activist. He said things about the need for job growth and protections, but he's sort of been all over the place. And So it's unclear where their positions are, but regardless of where they stand, to resolve these issues about the economy, about demographics, about jobs, you need bipartisan consensus. And that's been the problem with South Korea. There's been absolute gridlock because each side wants to just push forward their policies. I mean, we didn't mention the doctors' strike, and that's still ongoing as well, too. And again, both sides need to really come together, try to resolve these thorny issues. But um, yeah, so it'll be interesting to watch to see how any of these political parties and leaders try to tackle domestic issues, once we hear about the verdict from the Constitutional Court.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I've learned a great deal, as I'm sure our audience has as well. And now we're going to pivot to them to hear their point of view, and our fantastic Chelsie will handle that. So over to you, Chelsie.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all for your wonderful insights. I'm just going to jump right into some questions we've received from our audience, our virtual audience. If you have any questions, you can send them over to the policy@koreasociety.org email. The first question comes from James Bretsky, a TKS member. And, during following Yoon's martial law declaration, we saw protests, South Korea's unique protest culture. And we mentioned pro-Yoon supporters kind of delaying some of the proceedings happening now. And so James's question is, how does university student involvement compare and contrast with the campus demonstrations of the 70s and 80s? And that question's up for anyone to answer, so feel free to
Well,
get in there.
as someone who spent a lot of time on the streets of Seoul in the 1980s, breathed in more than a few whiffs of pepper gas. There are some overlaps for sure, some echoes, and I think in the beginning, as Kelly was talking about, that kind of the immediate reaction and the flow of young people out in the streets and the spirit of those demonstrations definitely felt to me like an echo of the 80s and the 70s. But I think to some degree, of course, the counter movement on the conservative side is not something we saw before. I mean, in the 80s, it was this wonderful emerger of the Korean middle class and student activists who together formed the kind of force that overthrew, decades of military government in Korea. I don't think that kind of thing is going on now. So the polarization, in some sense, on the street is a little bit different to me.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think it's a little hard to compare in that one, a lot of activism in this era is going online, number one. Two is, when martial law was declared, it was late at night. Most people I knew were already asleep. I happened to be awake and run out to the National Assembly, but it was over pretty fast. And so a lot of people woke up the next morning to the news with very little sense of what actually played out. And so there wasn't enough time, I think, literally to mobilize that kind of democratic spirit in the young population there. And then the other thing is, I think there has been this sense in the Korean media that the writing is on the wall a little bit based on the fact that the martial law declaration was shot down so swiftly and the proceedings to impeach Yoon happened so fast that I don't think there's that same feeling of a common struggle for South Korean democracy at this point, which was obviously very dramatic and was a matter of life and death in the 70s and 80s.
Yep. Yeah, thank you both for your insights there. Any comments from Andrew? We can move on to the next question.
No, I mean, I think Dan and Kelly covered it well. There's some parallels that you can make, but because this is a post-material society, and it's not seen necessarily as a life and death matter. I think if there was a hypothetical, if martial law is imposed and then it persisted for weeks, we might see a different story about university students. They're on vacation now, so they probably would have mobilized. But I also think, as Dan mentioned too, that there are different interests at play. young conservative, men, even college students, they actually, many of them support Yoon. So it's not as unified as we may have seen, as we saw, in the 70s and 80s during the democracy movements back then.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point there. And so moving on to the next question, earlier in our conversation, we talked about Andrew's article with Aram Her on nationalist polarization. And Kelly also mentioned how public opinion and louder voices often become conflated. And so Jaebum Kim's question, he's the vice chairman at the Korea America Association, is how do you evaluate the impact of social media rumors on current events and the state of South Korean democracy today?
Sure, I can go first there. Certainly, social media and new forms of media are influencing the way people think about politics. But for me, it's really more on the fringe. YouTube has become really popular among those on the far right, and I have relatives even in Korea that I love them, I respect them, but when they listen to some of the information, some of it is disinformation. I've listened to it as well too, but and they might be supporting conspiracy theories. But in other cases, it's if you listen to it for a while, some of it may sound convincing, and if that's the only form of media that you're listening to, yeah, you'll think that the progressives had it out for Yoon Suk Yeol, that there was election fraud, and you begin to believe that if that's the only thing you're listening to, and you hear it over and over. And same with the far left sort of media and internet news. And if there are these echo chambers, then you begin to see this, or you see polarization reified. And I think that's the same problem here in the United States when you're only listening to one form of media that pitches a story from one perspective. It does have a polarizing effect. So how large that effect is, I can't really say, but it definitely is contributing to, what I've referred to as nationalist polarization.
Yeah. Any other comments? Oh, yeah, Kelly.
Yeah, my answer, I'm gonna try to refrain from giving too much of like a media-centric perspective, but I think in general, something that journalists grapple with is just kind of the decentralization of media and how social media essentially rewards controversy via engagement. And so what you have is an ecosystem where more and more people are able to be viewed as kind of like establishment figures of reliable information, and they are rewarded for having hot takes or increasingly polarized views. And so you see sort of a legitimization of conspiracy theories on places like YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and elsewhere. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, you also kind of lose your finger on the pulse of what the population is actually really thinking. And so it's tough. I mean, I think the fact that so much of what's happening right now is centered around conspiracy theories of election fraud definitely speaks to how social media is impacting the political scene right now. The thing is, this is not unique to South Korea. This is kind of a global thing at this point.
Yep, absolutely. I think both you and Andrew are right. Oh, Dan, if you want to hop in.
Well, the only thing I'd add is that, I mean, of course, social media is not a new phenomenon anywhere, but certainly not in Korea. But I think what I have noticed in the last few years is a real return on the right to kind of the old red baiting rhetoric of the national security law era, accusations, and to some and held not just in fringe elements, but I think in very serious amongst very serious figures in conservative politics in Korea, that North Korean agents are in control of the labor movement, and that there is this, the even the slogans that are being put out by unions and so on are dictated from Pyongyang and so on. And these, and not talking about whether how much truth there is to that or not, that really has contributed, I think, to a delegitimization process on both sides. That is, both the right and the left see the other side as having no fundamental legitimacy. That's a dangerous phenomenon and relatively recent, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. We also have a question from Tammy Overby that kind of ties into a conversation we had earlier about polling in South Korea, how a lot has changed since Yoon's martial law declaration and today. And so her question is, what is your opinion on the validity of polling in South Korea right now? Should we be taking it at face value? We touched on this a bit, but if you kind of want to expound a bit on that.
Well, I think I spoke about this earlier. First of all, Korean public opinion is incredibly volatile. And so even if the polls are accurate, they may only be accurate in a very short window of time. But I think in Korea, as in elsewhere, polling has become more and more difficult because people can't be reached in the way they used to be reached for polling methods. And so I think it's it just has become a less accurate, you know, picture of what's going on in the Korean public, at least in my view.
Can you
I
speak?
mean,
Oh, sorry.
oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to jump in. Can you speak on how polling has become different? Why we can't reach certain populations, Dan?
Well, for the same reasons we have in the US, young people don't tend to respond, I think, as much to polling. There's a lot of internet polling, which is sort of a self-selected type of polling, people who choose to answer an internet poll of one kind or another. So I think some of the polling methodology just doesn't work as well in a kind of, particularly in a sort of cell phone, internet-driven society.
Yeah.
Maybe Kelly and Andrew have a better view of this than I do.
Yep.
I mean, I actually do follow polls, but what Dan says is absolutely something we have to listen to, that you got to take a grain of salt. You got to look at polls with a grain of salt. I think it's helpful if you look at multiple polls and see if they're trending in similar directions. Real Meter, Gallup, Korea, some of the media companies like Jumang, they do polls. And they hire, these polling companies that have reasonable like sampling techniques. But because as Dan mentioned, though, there's people these days may not want to reveal their true views, or they might not respond, and so we have to take these polls with a grain of salt. But those are really the only tools that we have to go by, though, to try to understand South Korean public sentiment, and we also have to remember that things do change very quickly. So yeah, but I do follow the polls even for my research.
All right. Thank you both for answering Tammy's question. And so kind of looking forward, we have a question from Elizabeth Seville. Her question is, could you clarify what the consequences would be if impeachment is not upheld? And specifically, she's wondering what the practical implications would be, as well as the expected reactions from both sides.
If the impeachment is not upheld, there's going to be a lot of angry South Koreans. As I mentioned, I think we're going to see protests again, and not necessarily violent protests. I think the what we saw at the courthouse among the far right, protesters, that I hopefully that's an aberration and that's not the way South Koreans protest these days. We saw with the Park Geun-hye's impeachment, it was millions of people coming out at candlelight protests. I think we might see that kind of dynamic, but the question is, where do we go? Where do we move forward next? Because if he's not impeached, that means that his presidential powers, they're he's back in office again, and if the people don't want to see that, then we have another crisis, and what's the path forward? So um, it's not a scenario that I like to think about, but I feel like there's going to be protests for a much longer period than what we saw on December 3rd, if that's the case.
One of the things that I still don't fully understand myself is, of course, there is a separate process of prosecution for criminal charges of President Yoon. And even if the impeachment is upheld, I mean, not, reversed, if you will, that criminal process is still going to go on. and it's a possibility. I mean, he was arrested as a sitting president, that he could be, convicted and jailed, separate from impeachment. So, I mean, these two, it's a little bit complicated, and I look to Kelly and Andrew to explain it better than I have. But I mean, again, I think if that happens, we're in a world of trouble in terms of the Korean stability of the Korean political system. But
Yeah, I was just gonna say I'm honestly I'm not a lawyer, and I think part of the confusion around this is because if that scenario were to happen, it's just so unprecedented that we don't have much to look to for what would happen next, legally speaking. But it is true that Yoon faces criminal charges that carry, a sentence as high as life in prison, or in theory, the death penalty, although I doubt that that would be carried out at this point. And I will just say, having witnessed it myself, the protests that were going on leading up to his impeachment really did look a lot like the candlelight protests, and they were really swelling to a very serious mass. And I would imagine that that would happen again, if not double. And I think part of the confusion right now that we've spoken about throughout this talk about how big the sort of right-wing Yoon supporting political voice really is, respective to the South Korean population, is because the pro-impeachment people have been pretty quiet, right? Because they've gotten what they've wanted. South Korea has been praised for kind of showing itself very swiftly to be a strong democracy by shooting down the martial law and bringing legal consequences for Yoon. And I think if he were to stay in power, there would be a widespread view that South Korean democracy again is under scrutiny, and that there's something to prove on the global stage.
Yep, thank you all for that. And I guess we can end on one final question, kind of looking to the US ROK relationship and the implications of some of Trump's more recent actions. So we have a question from Christopher Rodi. His question is on what will Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminum and potentially on semiconductor industries have on Korean politics and a potential snap election?
So I'll defer on the snap elections of what that impact will be, but in terms of the Trump tariffs, I mean, South Korea is trying their best right now to put together of what they refer to as a big platter, I guess, of different offers, weight areas for cooperation. I mean, everyone's talking about shipbuilding, LNG, on energy cooperation, nuclear cooperation, things that Trump might like and appeal to him, to try to stave off those tariffs. But we've already seen 25% tariffs on steel. Now Hyundai's talking about maybe they'll set up a steel plant in the U.S. I mean, who knows? But it does make for big challenges for South Korea, especially on the semiconductor industry. I mean, look, there's been in the past 3 years at least $116 billion in investment, a lot of it in batteries and semiconductors. But the U.S. still needs to ensure these supply chains. But Trump is saying, well, we want to continue to have investments. We want them to come to the U.S. so that they avoid South Korean companies, Japanese companies to come to the U.S. so that they avoid the tariffs. But if you're South Korea, is that a good long-term strategy? Is it only because Trump, who's only going to be president for 4 years, is that the only reason why you're shipping or why you're relocating all your business and manufacturing to the United States? So I don't know if it would make good economic sense. So South Koreans may actually have to just bear the brunt of these tariffs. There's even complaints in South Korea that if semiconductor companies like Samsung or SK are all moving to the US, all our workers are going to want to leave there as well too. So there's going to be a brain drain. So it will put South Korea in a bind. But I also think, going back to the theme of today's discussion, depending on who's in power, if Yoon is indeed impeached, will lead to differences in how South Korea might respond to these tariffs.
I think that this is a serious issue for South Korea. The economy, South Korea has the most trade-dependent, export-dependent economy in the OECD, and much more so, for example, than Japan. Although I think Japanese are also deeply concerned about this. So the ripple effects of this, and we're already seeing slowing growth in South Korea, are huge, and it'll have political implications for sure. I think in some ways, I'm interested to see if the Japanese and the Koreans and maybe the Taiwanese, who could also be hit by semiconductor tariffs, might find themselves, in some sense, drawn together, if you will, uh, maybe with the Europeans as well, in finding ways to resist this type of trade war on the part of the Trump administration. And, no, they all want to avoid frontal confrontation because that just doesn't work very well. So they try and find ways to, well, as Andrew said, to offer up gifts and measures which maybe would ameliorate to some degree these things. But the drift is pretty clear no matter what, and I think it's a real challenge. Whoever's in power in Seoul. The big problem now is that you don't have an effective government in Seoul. So Koreans, I think, are watched Prime Minister Ishiba of Japan go to Washington and have a fairly successful visit, sort of keeping the wolf from the door for a while. But they can't do the equivalent of that because they don't have a government really. So I think that right now we're in this really curious moment in Korea where they can't actually do what they probably want to do and need to do because they don't have really they don't have a president. They have an acting president. So I think until we see the political situation get resolved in Korea, we're not going to see a really clear response to these kinds of trade war measures.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, I agree with all the points being made, but th this was kind of what I was trying to get at earlier, is I think there's a lot of anxiety here right now about South Korea not being on the best footing to deal with kind of a wild card president. I do know that South Korea is a major provider of steel, and so this would affect the country. And I think this conversation's been had before, even during the Moon administration, but it kind of once again brings to the fore the idea that South Korea really needs to diversify how it's going to grow its economy. In the same way that Trump has triggered a lot of discussions about self-security and self-reliance in Europe, because of, his comments about NATO, I think South Korea is going to have some serious discussions about how it can deal with the political winds of the United States economically, because whether or not Trump stays in office or a new candidate is elected after him that is similar, it's pretty clear that we're dealing with a new political landscape where South Korea cannot predict that the U.S. is going to be the kind of partner that it always has been in this way. The other thing that I thought was interesting that I've heard from another analyst in recent weeks is just this idea that Trump kind of sees himself as a deal maker first and foremost, and he doesn't particularly care if he's making deals with friends or foes. And I think that this really underscores that South Korea needs to make itself enticing as a partner to work with on a greater basis than it's just a longtime ally of the United States.
Yeah. Thank you all for your insights, and thank you to our virtual audience for submitting questions. And I'll turn it over to Jonathan to tee us off.
Thank you, Chelsie. Great job. Kelly, Andrew, Dan, you did a wonderful job. Please let us give you a vicarious round of applause. And I hope you feel that from the 250 people plus who registered for this program to watch it online, and the many more who will watch it eventually. And as audience members, if you made it this far to 1 hour, 15 minutes into the conversation, then kudos to you. That's wonderful. You should consider Korea Society membership. We accept individual memberships, and we greatly appreciate your support. Just tee up our next program, which is next Wednesday, February 19th. We're doing a program jointly hosted with the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and we're going to do a conversation on nuclear deterrence and readiness with U.S. Air Force Major General Jason R. Armagost, who is in charge of the Mighty Eighth, which is responsible for the U.S. Air Force's Bomber Force and Airborne Nuclear Command and Control assets. So an important military figure who's going to give us some important insights into all the geopolitical shifts in the region, how that impacts U.S. national security interests as well as that of our allies. So thanks everybody for tuning in today. Great conversation. Kelly, Andrew, Dan, Chelsie, great job. I'm so happy to be able to chat with you this morning. And behind the scenes, we've got Peter and Bradley making this production possible. So thanks very much to them, as well as our interns who are helping to provide us with the questions from our audience. So thank you so much. And everybody have a great day.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks,
Thank
Chelsie and
you.
Jonathan. Great to
Thanks.
join you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Great job. Thanks, everybody.